In our previous video, I mentioned that earlier this spring we had attempted to start our entire garden worth of veggies from seed, as another huge step towards our long-term goal of food self-sufficiency. But unfortunately, I also mentioned that just 1 week after finally planting out all of the seedlings, we lost over half of them to an unexpected June frost. So unfortunately, we ended up having to buy some replacement seedlings after all. But after a few weeks, many of those that we weren't able to replace looked as though they might actually make it. So we decided to leave them be and see how they'd turn out. Well, now a few more weeks later, we thought it might be fun to give you another really quick update, because things are finally starting to look like a garden again. And while in the interests of honesty, I think it's important to share the sometimes not so great side of gardening, it's also nice to showcase the mini successes when they happen. So in this video, let's take a quick look at the plants that were fighting for their lives last time, and see where they're at today. First of all, our delicate basil plants are back to full health, and we've recently begun pruning them finally, so that should help encourage extra growth and bushiness. The parsley and chives are also doing well, but the frost never seemed to bother them much anyway. And the rest of the herbs, like the oregano, thyme, and dill, are all coming into their own as well. Next to the herbs, the tomatoes are doing great. Still behind a bit, but overall we're pretty pleased. We've also recently pruned them as well and strung them up to be grown vertically, so their young fruit are on full display. In fact, we just picked our first few ripe tomatoes earlier this week, and several others should be ready soon. Now, moving on to the summer squash, the zucchini are proving to be an interesting example of resilience. These two plants were hit pretty hard by the frost, while these two were planted afterwards as replacements. And yet, not only have the originals survived the ordeal, but they're actually larger and healthier looking than the nursery plants. And were also the first to put out fruit. So I guess the advantage of an extra week of root growth more than made up for the huge disadvantage of losing all their leaves so early on in their life cycle. And it's a similar story for the cucumbers as well. If you recall, this plant was just starting to show signs of new life in the last video. And now, a few weeks later, it has large leaves and the beginnings of some healthy-looking vines. Plus, most of the plants have been putting out tiny little fruit, and some of the English have already produced their first harvests. So after initially thinking that we might not get any cukes this year, we couldn't be more excited to see these encouraging results. And as usual, the winter squash and melons have been a bit slower to get going, but all of the plants are now looking green and healthy, and most are putting out tangled vines and plenty of flowers. Once again, these were all reduced to shriveled up stems earlier in the season, but now there's no noticeable difference between the originals or the few replacements. And recently, we've spotted several young cantaloupes, a tiny watermelon, and a pumpkin as well. And we've also just spotted our first spaghetti squash. So while we don't have any fruit on the acorns or butternuts yet, at this point, I think it's really only a matter of time. Now, if you recall, all of our pepper plants had to be replaced after the frost, but most are finally beginning to flower, and I've just noticed our first actual pepper. So at this point, I'd say we're pretty much in line with our normal growing season. And all of the beans and peas are doing great now too, and have been making for some superb summer snacking while working among the other plants. And as you can see, we're trying out some wire trellises this year, and so far the vines seem to be loving them. However, that reminds me of another bean trellis that we've been attempting, which is more organic in nature, namely our corn stalks. Some of you will recall that we first tried out the Three Sisters method a few years ago. There's a link in the description if you're interested in that video. But essentially, it's a method of interplanting corn, beans, and squash to form a symbiotic relationship where all three plants provide some form of benefit to the others. But unfortunately, one of the benefits we weren't able to achieve in the past was having the corn stalks work as a scaffold for the beans. However, as you can see, we seem to have finally gotten it to work this year, and I think the main difference has been timing. Previously, we've planted the beans once the corn made it to about 6 inches tall. But with our shorter season, that always left us with beans planted so late that they never really grew large enough to take full advantage of the corn trellis. So this year, without putting much thought into it, we planted the corn and beans at the same time, and then just forgot about them. But now, without any encouragement from us, many of the bean plants have found their way to the nearby corn and are winding their way up toward the sunshine. So unfortunately, this isn't a Three Sisters garden, because we've chosen to plant our squash in a different bed this year. But hey, at least 2 of the sisters are finally getting along as intended, so I'll still call this a success. And speaking of corn, a few of the plants are already producing cobs, as indicated by the appearance of silk. So that means that we, and if history is any indication, the raccoons and deer, are all in for another good feed of corn later this summer. Oh, and one family of veggies that doesn't typically get much attention on our channel is the greens, like lettuce, kale, and Swiss chard. Unfortunately, our spinach never came up this year, but everything else is doing great. In fact, we'd better get eating some salad before these guys begin to bolt. But speaking of bolting, so far that's been the case for most of our cauliflower and broccoli. Because though we started the summer with an unexpected late frost, it was followed almost immediately by an equally unexpected heat wave and weeks of drought. So unfortunately, many of the cool weather-loving brassicas have given up and chosen to go to seed instead. Oh well, maybe we'll have better luck with an autumn crop. But luckily, our cabbage still seems to be holding its own despite the heat, and some are beginning to ball up. Though it would be nice to see a bit more hustle from our Brussels sprouts, because so far they seem to be taking their time. But the strawberry plants are still going strong and living up to their ever-bearing reputation. And above them, the second-year asparagus ferns are still blowing gently in the breeze. But at their base, I'm proud to say that they continue to send up new spears, even now in midsummer. Keep in mind that each of these plants only produced a single stem last year, and now some have as many as 7, and all have at least 3 or 4. So I'm feeling pretty confident that this little experiment will be another for the win column. Not to mention that I'm also feeling pretty excited at the prospect of tasting a few next spring. And another veggie that I'm excited about is the carrots, because our results with them have usually been somewhat mixed. For example, this year some of our carrots never germinated. Some are up but pretty small, and others are growing nicely despite their imperfect spacing. But as usual, we won't know how they're really doing until we pull them from the ground. Kind of like our garlic. But luckily, there are still plenty of signs of progress up top, like all of the scapes we finished harvesting a week or 2 ago. Looks like we must have missed a few, but the rest are now resting comfortably in our freezer, in the form of a huge batch of pesto. And as you can see, many of the leaves are just starting to turn brown, a good sign that harvest time is slowly approaching, much like our potatoes, which have been flowering for the past couple of weeks. And in their case, that's often a sign that not only are we progressing nicely toward an eventual harvest, but also that the smaller new potatoes are likely available now, at least for those comfortable with getting their hands dirty, which, luckily for us, we are. So, after just a few seconds of poking around in the mulch, our efforts were rewarded with the first potato of the season. And while we're here, I figured this is a good opportunity to help illustrate a point I first tried to make in the frequently asked questions video last month. As you can see, the tiny tubers are mostly buried in hay, but they, and more importantly the roots, are still in full contact with the soil below. So while this method may seem a bit odd to the uninitiated observer, there's really no difference to the actual potatoes. They still come out full of nutrients and look and taste just like normal. But unfortunately, it's not all good news. You see, we've been successfully growing potatoes under deep mulch for about 4 years now, and so far haven't had any of the rodent issues that some of you have reported. We've usually chalked this up to either just good luck or some other yet unknown natural benefactor. But whatever it may have been, it seems to have failed us this year. Because while reaching in for signs of tiny spuds, I also noticed what seems to be signs of tiny critters. It's a bit hard to see in the video, but this is a tunnel. And from what I can tell, it's actually just one of many. Because out of the 5 or 6 plants I checked, all but one of them were equally excavated. So far, we've only noticed one nibbled tuber, but I'm sure that's only a matter of time. So who knows how much our final harvest will be affected. But another question that remains is why? Is it just that our luck simply ran out, and that a plethora of pocket-sized pillagers has just now stumbled upon our garden? Probably. But interestingly, this is also the first year that we didn't plant onions in close proximity to our potatoes. So maybe the pungent odor acted like a protective barrier in previous seasons. Or perhaps there's something much larger going on. For instance, I've also mentioned in previous videos that from what we've read, these sorts of infestations can be related to environmental factors as well. And if we look elsewhere on our property, like here on our forest trail, we pretty quickly notice that other tunneling rodents have also been far busier this year than our usual. So maybe it has something to do with the weather. But I guess all we can do for now is just observe and consider how we might protect next year's crop from a similar issue, just like we're doing in the rest of the garden while coping with the effects of that unexpected frost. Because though it can feel pretty frustrating in the moment, these are exactly the types of issues that make gardening so rewarding. There's always an opportunity to learn something new, and every single season is different. But as time goes by, we slowly pick up more knowledge and experience and pack more tools into our mental garden shed. Plus, the fact that each of us garden in slightly different conditions and locations makes it all the more interesting, because what affects us this year may affect you next year, or vice versa. But by sharing our experiences, we can all grow together. So whatever you're dealing with in your neck of the woods, either within your garden or without, thanks for being here and tackling these adventures alongside us. Don't forget, we are all in this together, even if sometimes we have to do it separately. But before we go, you may have noticed something new back when we were looking at the asparagus. As you can see, we've slowly begun making some more progress on that fence of ours. And as usual, we've also been recording it as we go, and plan to post a couple videos about it in the coming weeks. So please do stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.